It was a brisk morning at the bustling airport, the usual rush of passengers weaving through terminals, eyes glued to their phones, and hurried footsteps echoing through the halls. The air was thick with the clinking sounds of suitcases rolling on the polished floors, accompanied by the distant hum of overhead announcements. Amidst the crowd, a figure moved with purpose, a tall man dressed in casual attire. His black jacket, jeans, and cap gave him the look of someone traveling for business, not a man about to take control of a multi-million-dollar aircraft. His name was Captain Marcus Cole, a seasoned pilot with over 15 years of experience flying for one of the nation's top airlines. But on this morning, Marcus wasn't being recognized for what he was. He was just another passenger in the terminal, blending into the crowd. As he walked toward the gate, he barely noticed the group of airline staff gathered nearby, preparing for the flight that was scheduled to leave in just under an hour. What Marcus didn't expect was the moment that would change everything. As he neared the security checkpoint, a guard stepped forward, her eyes narrowing slightly as she studied him. "Excuse me, sir, can I see your boarding pass?" she asked, a polite but firm tone in her voice. Marcus reached into his pocket, pulling out the boarding pass. But as he handed it over, the guard's expression shifted. She glanced at the pass, then at him, raising an eyebrow. "Sorry, sir. You'll need to step aside." Marcus froze, confused. "Is there a problem?" he asked, a faint edge creeping into his voice. The guard didn't reply immediately, only gestured toward a nearby corner where two security officers were stationed. Without explanation, Marcus was ushered away from the line, his presence now drawing the attention of a few curious onlookers. It was strange, he thought. He was just a passenger. But this wasn't a random occurrence. Something about his appearance had caused them to suspect he wasn't who he appeared to be. The officers looked him up and down with suspicion. "We'll need to verify your identity," one said, still not offering any explanation. Marcus had been through airport security countless times, but today felt different. He was used to the occasional glance from passengers. After all, being one of the few black pilots in his industry sometimes made people look twice. But this felt like more. He stood there in silence, trying to make sense of the situation. His flight was boarding soon, and he still had a job to do. He needed to get to the cockpit. But instead, he was stuck in some kind of strange limbo, a place where his authority and identity seemed irrelevant. As the security team made a few phone calls and continued their checks, Marcus felt the frustration building. His hands clenched at his sides, the weight of the misunderstanding sinking in. He wasn't a passenger. He was supposed to be at the helm of the aircraft. But the longer he stood there, the more it became clear. Today, no one was going to let him through. Minutes passed. He was now officially running late for his flight, but no one was allowing him to move forward. He tried to stay calm, but the more he thought about it, the more absurd it seemed. All he had wanted was to do his job. But no one seemed to care. Minutes passed like hours. The sounds of the airport around Marcus became muffled, as if his surroundings were growing distant. The staff members continued their hushed conversations, their faces unreadable. He could feel the eyes of the few onlookers who had gathered, curiosity peaking as they watched the standoff unfold. Still, no one seemed to recognize who he really was. "I'm just trying to get to my gate," Marcus said, his voice steady but growing firmer. He wasn't going to let this go any longer. The security guard, a woman in her late 30s with short dark hair, was still examining his boarding pass. She glanced at him one last time, her expression unreadable. "I'm afraid you'll need to wait here for further verification," she said, her voice just a tad too formal. She seemed sure, almost too sure, that there was something wrong with him. Marcus, growing impatient, tried to push through his frustration. He knew the drill. Keep calm, let them do their job. But this was different. He wasn't a suspicious passenger. He was a pilot, and he had a plane to fly. He was used to being recognized by staff. He wasn't some random traveler. The mix-up felt almost surreal. "I'm Captain Cole. I'm scheduled to fly this plane today," Marcus said, his voice laced with professionalism. But it didn't seem to register. The guard glanced at him once more and then shook her head. "We've already checked the flight crew, sir," she said, looking down at the tablet in her hands. "You're not listed, you need to stay put." Marcus had heard enough. "You don't understand," he insisted, trying to stay calm. "I'm the pilot of Flight 416. The real pilot is ill, and I'm filling in for him today. You've got to let me through." The guard's face stiffened, as though the words didn't make sense. "You're saying you're the pilot in casual clothes?" she asked, disbelief hanging in her tone. "I'm a pilot all the time, no matter what I'm wearing," Marcus responded. "Now I need to get through." There was a beat of silence, the tension hanging thick. He could feel his pulse quickening, but he held his ground. He couldn't miss this flight. He couldn't just disappear into the crowd, not when there was an aircraft in need of his control. Suddenly, a new voice joined the conversation, one of authority. A supervisor, a middle-aged man with a thick mustache and a uniform that screamed, "Manager," approached. He took a long look at Marcus, then at the security team, and then back at Marcus. "What's going on here?" the supervisor asked, his voice edged with frustration. The security officer hesitated, clearly unsure of how to proceed. "This man claims to be the pilot for Flight 416, she said, pointing at Marcus. "But he doesn't look like one. I've never seen him before." The supervisor eyed Marcus again, then spoke in a voice that carried a certain weight. "Step aside," he instructed the security guard before turning to Marcus. "Sir, if you are the pilot, why aren't you in uniform?" Marcus felt a surge of frustration rush through him. He wasn't going to explain his career choices to this man. Not now. "I've been flying this airline for years, just get me to the gate." The supervisor, his brow furrowing, pulled out his phone, scrolling for what seemed like an eternity. Marcus watched, his heart pounding in his chest. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the supervisor looked up, his expression changing. "I see," the supervisor muttered. "I'll make a quick call to confirm. Please wait." The next few moments felt like an eternity. Marcus stood there, his hands clenched at his sides, trying not to show how much this was getting to him. The airport, usually a place of organized chaos, now felt like a waiting room for a trial he wasn't prepared for. His eyes darted around, trying to focus on something, anything to keep his mind from racing. The supervisor was still on the phone, his face drawn as he listened to whoever was on the other end. Marcus could feel the eyes of the few lingering passengers on him, some curious, others uncomfortable, unsure of what was happening. But no one moved. No one spoke up. The security officers, who had initially seemed so confident in their actions, were now uncertain, glancing nervously at each other. Marcus knew they were confused. The situation made no sense to them. A pilot, dressed casually, claiming he was supposed to be flying the plane? It was a hard story to believe. Still, he stood there, resolute. His flight was supposed to take off soon, and he couldn't afford to lose precious time. Finally, the supervisor hung up the phone and turned toward Marcus. The expression on his face was a mix of disbelief and resignation. "We've confirmed your story," he said, his voice low but firm. "But you should have been in uniform." Marcus was ready to snap. He wasn't a new pilot. He was a professional. His job didn't depend on the clothes he wore. It depended on his ability to fly and his knowledge of the aircraft. He knew what he was doing, but right now, that didn't seem to matter. The supervisor gave him an apologetic look, but didn't waste any time. "Let's get you to the gate," he said quickly. "The flight's about to board. We'll clear up the rest when you're on board." Marcus nodded, his frustration bubbling under the surface. But now wasn't the time. His mind was already focused on the cockpit, the controls, and the responsibility that was about to fall back into his hands. He followed the supervisor down the corridor, the noise of the terminal fading as he walked. The hum of the airport had turned into a distant murmur, his steps echoing in his mind. This was it. He was finally getting the opportunity to prove himself, despite the misunderstanding. But as he neared the gate, Marcus could hear the whispers, the murmurs from the people nearby, the curious onlookers who had witnessed the whole debacle. They had no idea what was happening behind the scenes, and most of them likely didn't care, But Marcus could feel the eyes on him. He wasn't just any passenger anymore. He was something else now, an anomaly. He arrived at the gate where the crew was ready to board, and it was clear the staff was still skeptical. Their eyes followed him as he walked up to the podium. But Marcus didn't care. He wasn't here for approval. He was here to fly. One of the gate attendants, a young woman, glanced at Marcus with uncertainty. "Sir, I'm afraid you can't board without confirming your identity. There seems to be a mix-up." "Look," Marcus said, his patience wearing thin. "I'm Captain Cole, and I'm filling in for the scheduled pilot. I don't have time for this. The plane needs to take off." The attendant hesitated, her hand hovering over the boarding pass scanner, unsure of how to proceed. Another few seconds passed before she nodded in response to some unspoken directive. "I'll get you checked in, Captain," she said, her voice barely a whisper. It was the first acknowledgement he'd gotten all day, and for some reason, it gave him a strange sense of relief. As Marcus made his way onto the plane, a sense of unease washed over him. It wasn't just the awkward silence hanging in the air, nor was it the skeptical eyes of the flight attendants as they continued their duties. No, what truly unsettled him was the uncertainty that loomed just beyond the cockpit door. As a seasoned pilot, he was used to confidently striding into a plane, his uniform pressed and his presence commanding. But today, in his casual clothes, he felt like a stranger in his own world. The passengers were settling into their seats, some casting curious glances at him as he walked toward the cockpit. Marcus tried to shake off the feeling. He had a job to do, and no amount of awkwardness was going to change that. He reached the cockpit door and took a deep breath. His hands gripped the door handle, his knuckles white with tension. The flight crew inside, the co-pilot and the flight engineer, had already been briefed about the situation. But Marcus could feel the palpable doubt hanging in the air. As he stepped inside, he was greeted by a terse nod from the co-pilot, who seemed to be sizing him up. The tension between them was thick enough to cut with a knife. Marcus could sense the doubt, the hesitation in the co-pilot's eyes. It was as if he were waiting for something, anything, to prove that Marcus was indeed who he said he was. "Everything okay?" the co-pilot asked, his voice polite but clearly filled with uncertainty. Marcus nodded, his gaze steady. "I'm Captain Cole. You've been briefed, right?" The co-pilot hesitated for a second, then nodded stiffly. "Yes, we've been informed about the situation. Let's get started then." It wasn't much of a welcome, but Marcus wasn't expecting one. The truth was, they weren't just concerned about the flight. They were concerned about him. His presence, his identity. Everything about this situation felt wrong. The crew didn't know him, hadn't seen him in uniform, and now they had to trust that he was capable of flying the plane. Marcus wasted no time. He moved to the cockpit controls and began his pre-flight checks, each motion deliberate and practiced. He could feel the weight of the responsibility settling on his shoulders. This wasn't just about getting the plane off the ground. This was about proving everyone wrong. Outside the cockpit, the passengers were still settling into their seats, unaware of the drama that had unfolded just moments before. It was easy for them to see a black man in casual attire and assume he didn't belong in the cockpit. But for Marcus, this wasn't a race issue. It was an issue of respect. He had earned his place in the cockpit long before this flight, long before today's unfortunate mix-up. But no one else knew that. As the final checks were completed, the co-pilot glanced at Marcus again. This time, there was a trace of understanding in his eyes, though it didn't fully erase the wariness. "Ready to go, Captain?" the co-pilot asked, his voice now more neutral. "Ready," Marcus replied, his voice steady. This was what he was born to do. The engines roared to life as the plane's massive turbines hummed, vibrating through the cabin with an unmistakable power. Marcus felt the familiar surge of adrenaline rush through him, but it was different this time. His fingers gripped the control yoke with purpose, but in the back of his mind, there was the lingering weight of doubt, the skepticism from the staff, the passengers, even the co-pilot. Yet he refused to let it control him. This wasn't his first flight, and it wouldn't be his last. Today, the only thing that mattered was the task at hand, Getting this plane in the air and ensuring everyone on board made it safely to their destination. The taxiing down the runway felt almost surreal, the usual noise of the airport fading as Marcus focused solely on the task at hand. He adjusted the flaps and checked the instrument readings, his movements swift and confident. Every check, every turn of the dial was precise. This was second nature to him. He could feel the passengers' eyes on him, but they wouldn't know the half of it. They didn't know about the confusion before takeoff, the barriers he had faced just to step foot in the cockpit. To them, he was just another pilot doing his job. But inside, Marcus was battling the feeling of being an outsider in his own world. "Cleared for takeoff," the co-pilot announced, his voice steady, despite the unease that Marcus still sensed lingering. "Roger that," Marcus responded. He pushed the throttle forward, feeling the aircraft begin to surge down the runway. The moment of liftoff was always one of beauty, when all the checks and preparation came to fruition. But for Marcus, this time felt different. As the plane ascended into the sky, the city below grew smaller, the airport's lights twinkling as if they were the faint memories of a world he had just left behind. It was then that Marcus realized the weight of his situation. This wasn't just a flight. This wasn't just about getting the plane in the air. It was about asserting his place in a world that had constantly overlooked him, about proving that he belonged here. He had been doubted before, but today the stakes felt higher. He had to succeed. For himself, for his career, and for every person who had ever doubted his abilities based solely on his appearance. The plane lifted higher into the clouds, and Marcus finally felt the knot in his chest loosen. The hum of the engines, the flickering lights on the control panel, everything was falling into place. He was back in control. It wasn't just about the flight anymore. It was about showing the world that no matter how he dressed, no matter how they saw him, he was exactly where he was supposed to be, flying the plane. As the plane cruised smoothly through the skies, Marcus kept his focus on the cockpit. The hum of the engines became a constant, soothing background noise as he settled into the rhythm of the flight. But despite the calm inside the cockpit, he knew that outside, the situation was far from settled. It wasn't just the co-pilot or the crew who had their doubts. The passengers, too, had noticed something odd. The plane had already taken off, but there were still murmurs among them. The whispers had started softly, comments about the pilot in casual clothing, confusion about the identity of the man in control of their aircraft. It was an uncomfortable feeling, knowing that some of the passengers were questioning him, their eyes glued to the cockpit door, unsure whether or not they were in safe hands. For Marcus, it was a challenge he had faced countless times before. As a black man in an industry dominated by people who didn't look like him, he had often been overlooked or doubted. His skill and experience were often questioned based on assumptions that had nothing to do with his qualifications. But today, he wasn't just a pilot trying to do his job. Today, he was proving a point. The thought weighed heavily on his shoulders as he glanced over at the co-pilot, who was busy monitoring the flight instruments. He could feel the tension in the cabin, but there was nothing he could do about it. Not yet. The passengers would have to come to their own conclusions. The flight attendants were still performing their duties, but the slight unease in their posture spoke volumes. They too had been caught off guard, unsure of how to react to the situation unfolding in the cockpit. It was only after the plane had reached cruising altitude that the realization began to settle in. A woman, seated near the front of the plane, leaned over to speak to one of the flight attendants. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her voice laced with uncertainty. The flight attendant, who had been hovering nearby, hesitated. She had seen the situation unfold from the moment Marcus had boarded, but now, with the plane safely in the air, she could see it for what it really was. A misunderstanding, a mistake that had nothing to do with Marcus's qualifications. She straightened, offering the woman a reassuring smile. "Everything's fine," the flight attendant said. "Captain Cole is one of our most experienced pilots. There was just a little mix-up earlier." The woman nodded slowly, but her face remained unsure. As the stewardess moved on to the next row, the whispers began to fade. But in their place there was a subtle shift, a quiet realization that things weren't as they had seemed. Marcus wasn't just some random passenger trying to get on the plane. He was the pilot. And he had been doing his job the entire time with nothing but professionalism. A man sitting a few rows behind the woman overheard the exchange and turned to his seatmate. "I thought he looked familiar," he murmured. "Didn't know he was the captain. Must have been an odd situation, huh?" The seatmate, who had been too caught up in the earlier drama to pay much attention, looked up at the cockpit door. "Yeah," she said slowly. "I'm glad it's all sorted. He seems like he knows what he's doing." And just like that, the whispers began to die down, replaced by a slow but steady realization among the passengers. Marcus Cole was their captain. He was in control, just as he should be. There were still a few skeptical glances, but the tension in the cabin had significantly lightened. For the passengers, the issue wasn't the man flying the plane. It had been the circumstances surrounding him, the confusion, the casual attire, the doubt. As Marcus glanced up at the cockpit door, he couldn't help but feel a little vindicated. The passengers had finally figured it out. He wasn't just some passenger anymore. He was their captain, and he was going to make sure they got to their destination safely.